Tonight we're very honored to have two very important guests here for us, artist Les Levine and curator Sarah Robayo Sheridan. Les Levine was born in Dublin in 1935, moved to Canada in 1958, and has been living in New York since 1964. He is the founder of Museum of Mod Art, Inc., and has made over 200 videos and held over 100 solo exhibitions during his career. He was awarded the National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship in 1974, 1980, and his work is represented in the permanent collections of Museum of Modern Art, New York, Whitney Museum of American Art, New York, Philadelphia Museum of Art, Corcoran Gallery of Art, Washington, D.C., the National Gallery of Canada, Ottawa, Centre Georges Pompidou, Paris, among others. He has written for Arts, The Village Voice, Art in America, and the Saturday Review. He's known as the founder of what became known as media art. And just a couple of weeks ago, on February 15th, at Bard College in New York, Les Levine Mod Art hearings took place at Every Art Center, Center for Film, Electronic Arts, and Music, at Bard College. And the hearings were first performed in 1971. On view in the galleries, it's a series of lithograph prints made from an issue of Culture Hero, an art tabloid that was published in 69 to 71 and lasted only 5 issues. And this weekend there will be on rotation 2 films by Les Levine, I Am an Artist from 1975, and Analyze Lovers, The Story of Vincent from 1990. Sarah Robayo Sheridan is curator at the Art Museum at the University of Toronto and an occasional lecturer in curatorial practice. She was the guest curator of the traveling exhibition Les Levine Transmedia at Oakville Galleries in Toronto. The exhibition surveys Les Levine's output from the mid-1960s to the early 1970s, a time when the artist was closely connected to the Toronto art scene. Without further ado, I leave Les and Sarah join us tonight.
Perfect. Hey, thank you very much, Joey, for the introduction and for the invitation to come and speak here. I want to preface our conversation by saying that we spent the larger part of the afternoon reducing the slides down. So if you feel that this is an overabundant and very substantial set of works that we're looking at, I want to assure you that the practice is even broader than what we will just merely brush up against tonight. And I would signal that also as a researcher of this work, I think this is what kept me going and interested, and I will warn you that now that you have seen more of these works, you will continue to encounter Les Levine's work, and the more you see, the more you find Les's presence amongst kind of the most vital movements in his time, and I think you'll get a sense from our talk and looking at these works, how prescient many of these works were and what resonance they also have for contemporary practice too. So they're arranged chronologically, and we're just going to go through them and talk about the different projects that we're looking at. So as a starting point, the slide that we have here is the earliest solo exhibition. So Les's career was launched in Toronto through a series of close solo exhibitions that really made waves, I think, for the scene there. So if you want to maybe describe that project, this is at the Mirvish Gallery.
Yeah, this was, I suppose, in Toronto, one of the first overall exhibitions, what could be called installation art. At the time, these words were not in the dictionary. And so this exhibition was done in 1964, but it was the process of maybe about 3 years' work in reality. So I sort of instantly became an infant terrible overnight because of this exhibition. But why don't we sort of go through the slides quickly so we can get to a point where we can have some discussion about this.
So you want to go through all 57 slides?
No, not them all, but we could just go to the
I'm
next
happy to
one.
agree.
Okay, this, closer? Okay. This is a piece called Plug Assist. It's very large, each one of those, I think. It's made out of plastic, and it's made by forcing a chair into a hot sheet of plastic. And this is what you get. And obviously, when people walked into an art gallery and saw this, they woke up.
And then just going back for a quick second, so you'll see that same chair is the kind of under structure, that those early pieces were actually stretched canvas.
Yeah. But then I realized when I got to this stage that a lot of this could be done by machine. Mm-hmm. And these pieces were actually made in a factory. Oh. I didn't make them by hand. And so we go on to these are the disposables. And these were made in very large quantities. I think the next slide coming up is going to show you an ad for the disposables. They were sold for, I think, somewhere between $3 and $8 a piece. They were made in thousands, and you know the term disposable art became instantly annoying. This is a piece called Slipcover. It was at the Art Gallery of Ontario. It consists of a number of these inflatable walls that are reflective. It also had closed-circuit TV in it, and it had a number of slides of the images that had been in the room before it was turned into this room. There's another slide of it.
And there was also, I think,
see the closed circuit
a
there.
relay of, it was sound, right? That
Yeah.
was at a...
There was a 7-second delay of sound, so if you were walking into the place talking to somebody, when you got into the room, you heard yourself talking to that person. This is a piece called Star Garden. This is at the Museum of Modern Art. It consisted of these large free-blown domes, and you can't actually go inside it. You're just on the outsides of it.
And then the technical process for making this is very similar to what you were practicing in these smaller disposables. It's also vacuum formed.
No, this is not
sheet.
considered to be vacuum formed. This
Okay.
is called free-blown.
Okay.
In other words, there's a frame around the plastic, and then air is blown in, and it forms this bubble. Mm-hmm. That's essentially how that's made. The vacuum form is the opposite. That pulls the air out.
Right. But this would mark a transition also if you're interested in working in space and outdoor space, and corresponds also with your involvement with the Architectural League of New York.
Well, I think, in the book there is that piece that I wrote for the National Gallery saying that this piece and other pieces like it were about nothing. And I gave a long diatribe about it being about nothing. And it turned out that it was about everything. This is a piece called Electric Shock. It had these wires above. You don't actually have to touch the wires to get the shock. It's static electricity. So if you're in a room and you get close to a person, you get a mild shock. This is called the process of elimination. It was on the building site that is now the Bob's Library for NYU. It was the empty site. And these pieces something like 3 of them were taken away every day until the site was empty.
And these are curved, it's maybe hard to tell from the slide, they're curved plastic forms.
Yeah, it's poly-expandable styrene. This is called a clean machine. You walk into it, it's these vacuum form shapes that form this corridor which goes around the entire gallery. You walk into the gallery, you keep walking, and then you're out of the gallery. And so that's what that piece was about. In a lot of these pieces, it's about some kind of physical, sensual experience as opposed to looking out, looking in, looking at something, looking towards anything. It's just about being there and having the sensation of being there.
And this was at Fishback Gallery?
Yes, it was. And this piece is a piece called White Sight. It's monochromatic sodium vapor. When you walk into this room, it's impossible to see color, any color. And of course, there were people who came into the room and claimed that they could see color, but they were lying. You can't. This is a piece called Iris. It consists of these 6 television monitors and 3 television cameras. When you look at it, you see yourself in various situations. It's one of the sort of feedback type pieces.
And this piece is from 1968.
Yeah.
But I know that you started to work in video as early as 1965. Do you want to spend a moment talking about what compelled you to start working in video and how you approached that medium?
Compelled.
Yeah. Or how did a camera land in your hands in 1965?
Oh, well, I don't know whether you know that I worked as a television director for the state of New Jersey. And so I had a lot of this stuff available to me. And I tend to be sort of like, you know, if I'm sitting here and there's an orange on the table, I tend to think, how could that become art? If there's a TV camera there, I tend to think, how could that become art? I don't sort of go to much effort. I tend to sort of just let it happen to me.
That's actually making me think back to the earliest work when you were situated in Toronto, that you were working as a process designer.
Yeah.
And I think that's, for me, when I understood that, it made a lot of sense for how you approach the works you make. Do you want to talk about what being a process designer looks like?
If you're a process designer, what happened, generally you're also, because of the nature of what you're doing, you're also the manager of the design section of the company, because you have to decide how everything is made. People design things and then you have to look at them and say, okay, we have the capability to stamp things, we have the capability to polish things, we have the capability to bend them, shape them, cast them, all these things, and I have to think about how do we make this design fit through all those processes. And normally, you know, people would think, well, that doesn't mean a whole lot, but in the long run, it tends to pervade my work. Because, you know, if you think about the disposables, or you think about the dome type pieces, or any of the pieces, they always sort of are about sort of, how would you do that? Or how is that made? And so I feel that even though when I was in school I was being taught as an industrial designer, I didn't graduate as one, but I did go close to that. And I think that sort of pervades a lot of the way I think about things. You know, it's not just about physical things, but other kinds of interactions too.
And so this was employing, do you want to describe actually a little bit how this piece worked?
How this piece
yeah.
works? Well, this piece was activated by a heat sensor, so that when you came close to it, it would project your image onto one of those screens in close-up, in mid-range and in wide angle. And it would move your image from one screen to the other screen. And so you would sort of, and this is way before, you have to understand, this is before every television store in the country would have these kinds of things in windows. You know, and now it would be meaningless to do such a thing.
Also, I mean, this particular image shows, I think, you in the frame, and that's pretty consistent, I should mention, even from the early promotional material that accompanied every project. And to single out that at that time it was very unusual to adopt that kind of publicity strategy as an artist. And I think you mentioned even those early shows in '64, you'd worked with a publicist to, assist in getting word out about the exhibition. Do you want to talk about sort of...
Well, why don't we move on to a few more slides, because we're going to come to that.
Okay. All right. Just
this is another one of those more complicated. This was first shown in Chicago. This was right in the middle of a room where there was a Franz Klein exhibition. So every so often you would see a Franz Klein in one of these monitors. This is a piece called Profit Systems. I put out a press release along with this saying that the profit or loss from this activity was the art. And as I was telling somebody today, that it was at a time when people were saying, like stockbrokers and what have you, that they work all day and they feel exhausted by this kind of activity, and then at the end of the day, they like to, or the weekend, they like to see some art. So they like to think of art as some kind of vacation, some kind of tourist activity. And so this was a way of telling them that they probably could see it in any activity that they engage in.
I mean, I note even the shares that you're buying are in cassette cartridge, and I note in your work there's kind of a constant self-referentiality. So they really lead from one to the other, and it occurs to me that this was happening close to the time that you also did the piece Wiretap. And there's a kind of real continuity, I guess, inside and across these projects. This is also raising for me the title of the book and the project that we put together is Les's title, Transmedia, as a descriptor for how to try and put together all of the different modes of working.
Tell them the original title?
No, that's off limits.
Okay.
Next slide.
I thought you would say next one after that. This is a piece called Cornflakes. This was done in Edmonton, Alberta, which at the time that this was done, 1969, was the corn capital of the world. It's now one of the oil capitals. And this was 250 jumbo boxes of Kellogg's cornflakes poured over Winston Churchill Square. And it's one of my favorite pieces, actually. I love things where you just do it and it looks as though you didn't do anything. But in the long run, it's... the whole point was to put something back into the earth that had been taken out of the earth. And so it was essentially a very early kind of environmental work. And I went up on the top of the building to take this photograph, and some young kids had gone into the center of it and made a big peace sign. And I took that to mean that the work was a success. This is a piece called Paint. It's 80 gallons of paint poured on a floor. And this is the, at a certain point, my work sort of kind of it takes on these kinds of sensations of wanting to make the gallery a whole thing as opposed to an individual work. This is called Systems Burn-Off Multiplied by Residual Software, the shortest title I could come up with. This is 31,000 photographs taken at the Earth Art Show at the Cornell University Gallery, and it's 31,000 photographs, and then 50 gallons of Jell-O being poured over the photographs, and then a set of photographs have been attached to the wall with chewing gum. And somehow or another, people are always asking me to explain this piece, but simultaneously, curators are all over the world are always asking me to remake the piece. So I think that's enough of an explanation.
I like the anecdote too. I mean, the reason, the way you saw that Earth Art Show was also, you were invited as a member of the press, right?
Yes.
Based on publishing Culture Hero, was it? Or how were you? Yeah.
No, because I had
pursuit
written for places like the Village Voice and other places like that, they invited me. But the point, I think this is a crucial piece for me because it's the transition into the idea that the information that is residual to the act of making art is what the art becomes. In other words, it's even more so today. You can't imagine that the information that is projected by the work has no meaning in relationship to the work. In many cases, it has more meaning than the work. The actual physical work is just like a corpus delicti, a dead body.
Speaking of dead bodies.
This is Levine's restaurant. This was actually a real restaurant, and it was Irish, Jewish, Canadian cuisine. There was no such thing as that, but nevertheless, this whole thing came about because Mickey Ruskin, who had a restaurant called Max's, used to give artists tabs in exchange for works of art. And so a lot of people, many artists of the 60s and 70s did that. And so Mickey asked me to do a work, and I said, well, why don't we just do a restaurant? Why don't we invent a whole thing? And so we came up with this idea that this was Irish, Jewish, Canadian cuisine, and that it was Mama Levine's, recipes. I didn't want to tell him that I ran from Mama Levine's recipes, but nevertheless, that's the whole idea was that it was in fact a pure invention. So it was, total artifice from beginning to end. And about something like a year later, I was invited to UCLA to visit the studios there, and lo and behold, there were two young men making a restaurant, as there are.
In this particular slide, there's also an image. This is part of the menus that were printed for the restaurant.
Yes.
And again, it's kind of quoting another work of yours, because that's you involved in the process of elimination. But I was also reading the finer print on this. I was interested. I mean, you really are applying autobiography in this work, as you sometimes do. And here, there's like a little blip where you kind of backdate yourself a little bit. I just wondered why.
Well, how do I backdate?
Well, you say you moved to Canada when you were 17. And
I didn't say that.
It's written right there in the menu, I swear.
That is somebody's mistake. No, I moved to Canada when I was 21. So it may be a mistake, but it
Well, I just wondered if you were kind of intentionally being a little bit elastic with those details, or
no, I'm always trying to get away from myself, but I have found in the long run that I can't. That in the long run, the work always seems to get better when I just let myself fall into it. when I don't try to keep myself out of it, it always seems to resolve itself, because there's something in that I recognize as authentic. And one of the things I've always said is that it's the responsibility of an artist to authenticate the activity that he's presenting to you. And somehow or another, even though people look at my work and they say, well, it's this, it's that, it's inconsistent, it hasn't got a style, etc. and so forth. It does. It does have this kind of thing that you're talking about, is that you can always sense me in it.
Is this a good point to also discuss? I mean, you have a couple of alter egos that also emerge around the Museum of Mod Art as well. We'll get there. So this is Culture Hero, which you see the print edition of in the exhibition.
Mm-hmm. Well, Culture Hero was essentially a magazine. The whole idea was to let artists, represent themselves in a certain kind of way. I don't know that such a thing would be possible today, because it might have to be Curator Hero. I mean, that might be a more accurate description of the moment, because certainly artists are not as heroic as curators today. What?
But you might want to describe the editorial premise of this issue.
Oh, well, the editorial premise was that whenever we invited people to do something, we let them do whatever they wanted. We never sort of, this particular issue. Yeah. Well, in this particular case, I think that Jill Johnson, one person there is Jill Johnson, the person with the pipe, and the other one is Lucinda Childs, the American dancer, is the naked one. And I think, Jill said that I should do an issue on her. I'm not sure, but I think that sounds like Jill. And I think that, then I decided how it should be done. And I decided that, on these kind of we take the approach of, at the time, there were such things as sort of the East Village Other, and there were all these kinds of things which, before the New York Times got into these kind of lurid sexual descriptions of everything, the East Village Other was doing it. And my thought was always that the Times was very jealous and became the East Village Other. But anyway, we decided to do it, but of course we couldn't do it exactly the way Jill would have liked to have it done. So we decided to kind of emulate one of those kinds of cheap magazines that, sort of Pulp Fiction type things. And so we used all that kind of technique. But nevertheless, we asked all these artists and writers and people to do something. And when they did, we just accepted it the way they sent it in, and we put it into the magazine. And as I told you before, Jill was not happy with the idea, because she thought that once we agreed to do it, that we were going to let her have some say in it. But we realized that would be a big mistake. We made a bigger mistake by doing it the way we did it. But
yeah, I can imagine for her as a critic, it would have really turned the tables. So every single one of the contributions is somebody contributing something about Jill. Mm-hmm. So it's also a kind of form of portraiture as well. And then, again, there's a relationship between this and Wiretap, in that at that moment where you were recording all your studio conversations, a lot of the goings-on, communication-wise, were regarding the production of this issue. So there is Jill expressing her hesitation right before it goes to print.
As you may remember, I also did that piece, I Am Not Blind, where I interviewed a lot of unsighted people, and actually it was a great revelation to me how absolutely, the same as everybody else they are, except that they're unsighted. And so there's always been this sensation in my work about trying to arrive at the psychological aspects of portraiture through language.
I mean, also gossip figures importantly. I mean, that was sort of in the writing. And also I read a nice recollection from John Giorno about Culture Hero that he basically expressed the idea that gossip is our history. And so this ends up being a kind of archive of a community of artists at that time.
I don't know that gossip is our history. I mean, I would hope that it's more than gossip, but obviously gossip plays a part. This is the piece that somewhere close to home for you.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
my office faces onto this courtyard.
This is a piece called Red Tape, in which it was done at Hart House. I attempted to do this piece, and it wasn't really possible, but nevertheless, I recorded the whole thing, and Columbia University put the book out last year called Red Tape, which is the process of doing this piece. This is a piece called Artists in Residence. It was done at the AIR show, the software show. It is called AIR. What happened was there was a microwave transmission from my studio to the museum. And so you could see the artist in his studio in the museum. This was in 1970. A lot of the time when you think about these things, you think that maybe this is talking about the present or what could happen in the present. But it happened, in many cases, almost 50 years ago. So it's old art, even though it might not look old. It is old. This is the piece called Wiretap, which Sarah spoke about just a moment ago. And these are speakers, and when you go up to the speakers, you hear me talking on the phone to somebody about something. In many cases, it's very mundane. It's sort of like, where can we get that plastic? Can we get it somewhere else cheaper? Or something like that. It's nothing revealing. I mean, it's nothing where you could blackmail anybody with it.
Each speaker different?
So,
Is each speaker different, have a different dialogue?
there's 4 different conversations going on at once.
So the feel as you're walking through the spaces, sometimes there's repetition, because some of the channels are kind of moving around.
Yeah.
And actually, you taped over a 1-year period, or what was the kind of recording
I can't
time?
remember the length of period. But I think that what is, for me, somewhat interesting about this is that the National Gallery of Canada owns this piece. And so, it's a government-owned museum. And I think that I probably did that because I was thinking about, emulating. I do that a lot. I look at things and then I try to emulate them in my own way. Like I hear that the government is wiretapping people, and then I say, okay, I'll wiretap people. That's a good idea.
Yeah, actually, I remember distinctly one of the recordings is someone calling in and saying, Les, the word on the street is that you're tapping your phone. And yeah. So
Okay.
this is a press kit, also from 1970.
Yeah. Well, this is a catalog for a show at the Isaacs Gallery. It was called Press Kit, and it was a lot of press releases and what have you. And at the time when I did this, artists didn't put out press releases about their work. They just put their work up in galleries and then hope that people would come in and look at them and what have you. And it goes back again to what I said, a short time ago. I've always felt that the information that comes from art, the so-called residual, is what the takeaway from art is. And so I've always felt that it doesn't really matter what a critic thinks about the work. In most cases, they approach it from the point of view of their own psychology, etc. But I felt that, it was a time to introduce the idea of what an artist is thinking. In most cases, there are a lot of art books, etc., but we're always thinking about artists' thoughts in retrospect. At this point in time, which wasn't that much after abstract expressionism, if you think about it, abstract expressionism was still going on in the late 50s. And that was a period where the artists sort of said, it's wrong for artists to think. Artists that think are not real artists. Artists that drink are real artists. So I sort of was coming into the art world at that point, and I sort of was saying at that point, artists should think. It's okay. You're allowed. Take the permission. Do it. Think.
Can I ask the image that's on the front of the box, and also just a note, so it's a bunch of loose leaf pages, probably about 100 different sheets, photocopies, and the subtitle of the press kit was Les Levine copies everyone. I think that was the exhibition as well.
Yeah.
Is that image shot off of a television? It kind of has that striated
the image
look.
itself, I think, is shot off a television, yeah.
And was that a video work, or what was it taken from?
I don't remember exactly, but I like the idea of copying everyone. I think it's a great idea. Not possible, of course, but it's certainly, the idea of art being unique is interesting, but somebody told me that they went to see an artist, and this artist woke up every day and said, I start my work without anything in my mind. And I said to him, well, how come it turns out the same every time? So,
Now's when we get to talk about the Museum of Modern Art, Inc.
Yeah. We're at the Museum of Modern Art, Inc. In 1970, I started the Museum of Modern Art with a number of services. Again, it's like, today there are such companies that actually do this, that want to manage. Actually, Sotheby's is doing it now. They're starting to manage artists. They're starting to, treat artists as though they were their agents. They have a whole separate company. I forget what it's called. I think it's called the Artist Agency or something like that. And they do all these various things. And so Mod Art had all these services. But these services were, in many ways, kind of like esoteric services, such as how to avoid marrying an artist.
But also how to marry an artist. I think both services were offered.
Yeah. We never sort of discriminated on either side. If we sort of said, don't do this, we also said, do it. So, and then there's the After Art catalog. Even though After Art was, the concept that the idea of, the aesthetic power in society was no longer working. I mean, if you think about it, in the 50s and the early 60s, all the commercial artists would look at art to get ideas. now artists look at commercial artists to get ideas. So there is this kind of change. And also, I would claim that we're very much in an after-art period, because most of the art today has to solve a societal problem, or at least refer to it, and come up with some idea as to why it exists. So that is the kind of art that I call community-centered art. And it seems to me that most of the art today is involved with that kind of idea.
How did the services change between the Museum of Mod Art and the service catalog and the after art service catalog?
Well, the after art catalog was very much involved with trying to help people to not have to make art anymore, and various services of that nature, how to keep going without having to make art. And this is the Mod Art hearings. I think that Joey already talked about this, the Mod Art hearing. I've done it at various times. The first one was done in 1971, and then through various times I've done it again. I did it like about 10 days ago at Bard College.
Yeah, do you want to describe how it normally worked?
Well, the idea is that I'm sitting at one side of the table, and anybody can come up from the audience and sit at the other side of the table, and they tell me what they want to talk about, and then we talk about that. That's what the piece is. And again, it's the idea, or an idea that seems always to come to the forefront in my work, that what is communicated is the art. It doesn't matter whether it's a painting, a sculpture, a conceptual work, an environment, anything else. When the audience goes in there, whatever is communicated to them is what they take away as the art.
And what was the purpose of the live broadcast simultaneous in the room?
Here?
Yeah.
There was no live broadcast for that.
It wasn't closed circuit?
Well, that has to do with the idea of how something that is information is turned into media, and that kind of, transformative thing.
This is quite a different body of work from later, the Troubles.
Yeah, this is the Troubles, an artist document of Ulster. This is a piece in which I went to Northern Ireland, and I did a lot of photography and interviews about the war in Northern Ireland. And that's what it's about.
And it primarily was photographs that you took over. How long were you there?
I think we were there about 3 weeks or something.
And it really kind of toggles back and forth between Protestants and Catholic families. And was this also a response to what you felt was the existing media record of these political?
Well, one of the things that you realize, you certainly must realize it if you ever watch TV in this day and age, that all departments today, police departments, blah, 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 they all have information officers. And these people are always telling the press what they should write and think about these things. And when you go in a place like Northern Ireland, the British have, information officers. And these people, if you go to a press briefing, or, when a bomb goes off or something like that, and you tape record it, and then you look at the papers in the evening, you see that what's in the papers is exactly what the press officer has said. more or less. So it's a way of understanding that war is information, or information is war.
I mean, in this particular then photographic record that you produce, there seems to be an active attempt to work against kind of bias by balancing out the images of the subjects.
Well, it wasn't my position to take a position, if you know what I mean. I didn't think anything could be, you want to show the next slide? I didn't think anything could be helped by me sort of representing a point of view. As I think you know from me that I've said to you that ideologies are very often destructive to clear thinking. This is a piece called Watergate Fashions. When the Watergate was on, I made a drawing of each of the senators who was in the hearings, and I described the clothing they were wearing. And the people told me that I was being very frivolous for doing that, because this was an important political event. And I understood it was, but I'm an artist. And so I was making art. I wasn't making political commentary, which would have been an entirely different thing. And so I'm happy I didn't get involved with the politics of it. It would have been a failure. Oh, this is Nixon takes a new course in China. Show the next slide. And this is the position of the chopsticks in neon. and yeah, and sort of, this is, go ahead, go to the next one. This is what can the federal government do for you? And this was a piece I did. I made a lot of clothing with that slogan on it. What can the federal government do for you? And then there was a video, which you can't see it here, but there's a video where we went on the street and asked people that question, what can the federal government do for you? And one of the answers we got was they could give me a grant to do photography. So,
if I recall too, what can the federal government do for you? You proposed as a public art project for a government building in Ottawa.
I did?
Yeah. There's a book that, the catalog of that proposal process, and then the grounds for rejection of it ended up pivoting actually on your citizenship, if I remember. But the idea was to have, I think, collect all these people on the street and ask them what the federal government could do for them, and then air that, I think, on the elevator of the seat of government, basically.
Sounds like a good
I know
idea.
it exists.
This is a
Diamond
piece
Mine?
called Diamond Mine. You see, this is a piece of jewelry, and there were various other pieces of jewelry crossing this screen all the time. And I was saying to the screen, and he asked me why I was leaving. I said, I'm not leaving. I'm going on, continuing, because I'm afraid if I stay, I'll stop going on. And he said, I hope you know what you're doing. And I said, I don't have any choice in the matter. And he said, I wish you the best of luck. And so I think that this piece is pivotal in terms of all the things you've said. It's biographical. It is what I always think about art. You have to go on. You have to continue. I mean, I go in to see paintings and shows of various things, and you see that people do variations of things. And there's some development supposed to be in these variations. Here's one, here's another, here's another. I don't see any development myself. I see that they're just continuing because it's branding, it's a style. This is what I do. And here's another one of them. And I don't feel comfortable in that role. And so this piece is also biographical, but it's also about the life and death of an artwork. It's also the idea that artworks don't live forever. They do have a lifespan. And, you know, at least there is a time when they're alive and they make other people feel alive. And there's a time when they no longer have that pivotage. This is a piece called Deep Gossip, where you have all this sort of domestic type furniture situations, and then you have these TV sets, and you have close-ups of mouths, and you have these various people saying very intimate things about other people. This is a piece called The House of Gloves. I did this in Philadelphia. I was working with the fabric workshop there. And when I went there, they told me they could do, that they actually had made the fabric which the astronauts wear when they go into outer space. And I sort of tried to get them to do various things, and everything I said to them, they said, no, we can't do that. And eventually I said, well, what can you do? He said, we can make gloves. And so I said, let's make a house out of gloves. And so I made a house out of gloves, and then I had these 4 characters, a mouse, a rooster, a frog, and a pig inside the house. And the mouse said, this is the best I can do. And the rooster said, is this your best? And the frog said, I want your best. And the pig said, give me your best. And so that was that piece. It's interesting though, I had finished the piece, I put it up, I went back to my hotel to change my clothes and what have you. I was walking back to the museum where it was shown, and a young kid stopped me on the street. He might have been about 18 or 19. He said to me, go into that building. There's a house made out of gloves. These are the billboards, which are part of the media work that I did over the years. This is in the City of Industry in Los Angeles.
And when did these billboards start?
They started, I think, about 1979. This is in Minneapolis. This is We Are Not Afraid. This was in every subway car. There's like 5,000 of these in every subway car and every subway line in Manhattan. There are thousands of photographs like this of various. This is a piece about, again, which is based on the war in Northern Ireland. This was in London. This was in Dublin. I was sitting on a double-decker bus, and we passed this billboard, or one like it, and there was an old woman sitting right next to me, and she said, there's no need of that. And it took me a little bit of time, but sort of like in England, they sort of understood that it was about the war in Ireland. And in Ireland, they thought it was about what was happening with priests. So it made me wonder whether it's such a good idea to redo certain things. Because when you take the context away, everything changes. This was in Castle at the Documenta. You could just go through these fast. This was...
That's the same character from the House of Clouds?
Yeah, it's the same character. I mean, I can't get rid of my children. Okay, that was the... Can you go back to...
Oh. Yep.
Yeah. These kinds of things always happen with the billboard campaigns, where you get, the control arms thing, which is the cat, and then you have perestroika. It seems like they're part of the same advertisement. And that happens because with this particular set of work, I never accept, billboards for free. I always have a contract and pay for the billboards because I feel that it's important, an important aspect of doing the project, that it be understood to occupy the same space as the corporate world. It's not just about the imagery. It's about how the corporate world uses the imagery. And so it has to be in the same space as the corporate world. It just can't be a billboard company saying, oh, here's a billboard somewhere, take it for nothing. And in many cases, like in Britain, when we did the billboards there, the police wanted to arrest me because they said I was going to cause riots. And they wanted to take the billboards down. And the billboard company was ready to do that. But I said to them, but I have a contract with you, and you can't do that. And feeling that they were backed up by the police, they said, oh yes, we can, we're going to. And I said, let me talk to the president of the company for a minute. And we went into a separate room, and I said, really? Do you want the police telling you what you can put up and what you can't put up? Just imagine what that's going to be like in the future. And so he came out and he said, no, the billboards stay. And the police couldn't do anything about it. This was in the New York subways, Consumer Perish and Pray for More. Two different billboards. This was in Poland, in German, keep going. This was no new artist. Keep going. This is Win the Race. This is in Vienna. This is also in Vienna. This won the Gustav Klimt Prize for outdoor advertising. It's only interesting.
Is the prize for outdoor advertising?
Yes. It's only interesting because it beat out Mercedes-Benz and Calvin Klein. And everybody, I was back in Vienna sort of like 2 years later, and everybody was copying this style of doing it. And it's worth noting that in all of the billboards that I do, I've always sort of hand-drawn them, or drawn them on computer and then made them look hand-drawn by computer. And people always ask me, why would you bother to do that? You just put the photograph up there. And the reason is because when you're in the outdoor advertising space, it's about visibility. And when you put up something that's hand-drawn in a place where everybody puts up photographs, it's more visible. This is a piece called a Mind Box. These were empty boxes, and they had printed. We had to, because it's the law that you have to print, you can't sell an empty box. You have to print on the top, this box is empty. And on the side, it had all the elements of the mind, all the ingredients, so to speak. And these boxes were sold in this is a supermarket where they are, a courtyard of a supermarket. And this was in Hanover, Germany. And a lot of Germans came up and bought them for 5 marks. The money was for UNICEF. And once in a while somebody would say, "Was ist das Mind?" And the concept of mind is not understood in Germany. It might be sort of something like Geist, but mind is not a thought in German. So I didn't know that until I did that. And this is in Gateshead at the Baltic Flour Mills. This thing is 60 feet wide. And this is in Stuttgart, Art Can See. And this is in Duisburg. This is the American flag, by the way.
Plus yellow.
Yeah, plus yellow. And this is a series of photographs. There's one more. And so,
were these billboards or were these postcards?
no, they're
Last two?
big.
Okay.
They're large photographs. Anyway,
We actually made it to the end of the 57
we
slides.
came to the end of that set of slides. We did it, in actual fact, to show you the whole body of work would take about 500 slides. And we just decided to deal with the group that were dealing with certain kinds of really shifts in, attitude. But
I think there's occasion actually maybe to field questions from the audience.
absolutely,
Yeah.
by all means. You have a question?
I have an observation. I know you didn't grow up in New Jersey, but your sense of humor is very East Coast.
Really?
I think so,
I thought it was Irish.
It might be Irish, Jewish, Canadian.
But it's Jewish humor, I'm from the East Coast, and we did have an Irish rabbi,
Really?
from Newport, Rhode Island, but it seems like you're, even in your interpretation of art, it's fun, it's
Well, I've always said, and don't take this facetiously,
not at all.
but I've always said that if you're serious, you don't have to be serious.
No,
There's nothing wrong with, a little lightness about things. But at the same time, if it's just a joke, it's just a joke.
well, you're not making a joke, really. It's you actually make somebody think, because the way it's done lightheartedly. Because it's not lighthearted.
Yeah. But anyway, let me go back a little bit and tell you a little bit about, seeing as you brought up whether I'm from New Jersey.
And you lived in, you're not.
Yeah, no, I don't want to insult people from New Jersey.
No, I know you're not.
That's you really know how to hit a guy. That's all I could say. But anyway, I grew up in Dublin, and something that maybe a lot of people don't know about me is that my uncle was Victor Waddington, the well-known London art dealer who lived in Ireland at the time that I did. And he used to babysit me as a child, along with his son. We're both the same age. And one of the first things I remember about art was that he took me to Jack Yeats's studio. I don't know if you know who Jack Yeats is, but he's a very famous Irish painter. Probably the most famous Irish painter. And, that was the first, when I was 8 years of age, that was the first encounter I ever had with art. And I had no idea what art was or anything like that. And we were just dragged along because we were in his charge, and that's what he was doing. He was going to Jack's studio, and so we went there, and I still remember quite clearly the painting that Jack was working on at the time, and I still knew. From time to time, I went back to see Jack Yates, and I knew him actually when he died, and so. In some way, I never recognized this as having any influence on me in any way. But obviously it must have. Yeah.
When did so you first started making art when you were in Canada or before you moved to Canada?
No, I first started making it in Canada. Even though I went to the Central School of Arts and Crafts in London, I really wasn't in the art department. I was in the design and industrial design department. And when I went to Canada, I became a student of Michel Teitelbaum, who was, in my opinion, a terrific teacher and recalcitrant and drunk. But nevertheless, he was, he was a painter, and Hans Hofmann had been his teacher, and he was teaching us students, and the way he taught us was that we had to paint the same subject all day long, and come back the next day and paint the same subject all day long, and do this day in, day out, month in, month out. That's the way his approach was. And his approach was that you have to keep bearing down on the subject. You can't let the subject become sentimental. I can remember him saying to me at one point, I can see that you can handle these materials, but let's see if you have anything to say. And that always stuck in my mind. Not that I had anything to say, but that someone should have something to say. And so I think in a funny kind of way, Michel was an extraordinary influence on me. He didn't, the kind of art that I made was in diametric opposition to the kind of art he made. And when he came to my exhibitions, he would, look at me slyly and wink at me and say, give me the impression that he wasn't too happy about it or what have you. But in a funny kind of way, somehow or another, I seem to have gotten from him the idea that you really had to be extremely serious about what you did. And my way of being very serious about what I did was to not allow anybody to see how serious I was. And it's like I've always felt about a work of art that you should always think when you look at it, I could do that. He's doing nothing.
Well, it's like taking a complex idea and distilling it down to its simplest form, but in a simple form, it still has so many meanings to it.
Yeah, I always thought sort of like when I looked at Roy Lichtenstein's early works, when I would go there, he makes it look so easy. It looks like he's doing nothing. And somehow or another, I always felt that it's important to do something that, what you said about biography, it's what I got from Michel was the idea that immaterial of how hard you try, the work never becomes terrific until it's very clear that you're in it. And one of the things that he would always say when he would come into my studio, he would look at what I was doing, and if he thought it was okay or getting somewhere, he would say to me, "Why don't you try and do a self-portrait that way?"
Sarah, could you speak
And-
a little?
Sorry?
I was going to ask a question after you're done.
Go ahead.
I wonder if you could speak a little bit about your curatorial process in looking at such a varied body of art, a body of work. I know that you spoke about kind of your end results within biography and pulling those threads, but what was that like initially?
It was amazing. I mean, it's one of the reasons that the book that I did write only covered one decade. I was also interested in the origin of the research was also, I was spending a lot of time in Ab Isaac's archives, which are held at York University. And I had done previous work in that archive, and I knew Les's work through, mostly through Museum of Mod Art, through the influence of Stephen Lieber in San Francisco, who was specialized in this material. And I had been involved in a totally different project and just held it as a placeholder, like I need to come back to these archives and spend some time in these files. And I was also interested in, some local crossovers as well, like myself coming to be a curator in that city and wanting to kind of understand a little bit in how this amazing artist figured in the scene at that time and what it could tell me about what was going on. I was a bit curious. Even Toronto is very well known for the Toronto School of Communications and for Marshall McLuhan's work, but it struck me that Les was writing his own kind of media theory through these works. But in terms of parsing out what went into the exhibition, I restricted it to that initial decade because I felt like already there, and I still feel confident in this, you could report back on the entire breadth of the practice through these key concerns that sort of are perennial throughout the work. So there was a lot of material, lots of different materials represented in the show. So it had some of those larger scale vacuum form pieces. It was quite heterogeneous, and then also the print and publicity material figured very prominently alongside those works. So there was a real, I think, also allusion to that work in the archive, and just the kind of cross-threading of all of these projects together and how much integration there was. The book is also divided basically in chapters that kind of separate out how I was understanding the production. So there's a small bit introducing the early practice, this kind of relationship with Michel and his teaching, and the chair, and that object lesson of the chair, and this kind of clash. And then disposables as a category, then places, and then software. So those were the basic chapters of the exhibition as well. I hope that answers the question. Are there any other questions?
Yeah, I just have a question back to Les. How was it having Sarah look back at that moment? Were there surprises of how she interpreted it? Were there things that came up for you?
Well, it's always surprising how people interpret things because initially when Sarah approached me to do this, I didn't take it seriously because I didn't think it would ever happen. And I thought, I'm asked to do things all the time, and if they're far enough away, I say yes, and thinking that it will never come. But then sometimes it does. And so initially I didn't take it very seriously. And then when Sarah came to my studio to start doing research, I sort of realized that she's a very serious person, and she's, making me try to remember things I couldn't remember.
Yeah, Les is being polite. He once described it as a form of acupuncture, I believe, where when you think it's done, there's still like another little pain that kind of crops up. Yeah.
Well, the thing is that it's much of it was 50 years ago, and so it's not that easy to remember things that happened 50 years ago. It might be if you didn't do anything else, but it's not that easy in many cases. And then you have to understand that when people look at things from 50 years ago, they do it with a revisionist eye. They don't think about what was 50 years ago. They think about what does that mean in context of how I see it now. And for me, that's sometimes very confusing. But nevertheless, I think that it's obvious from the exhibition and from the book that Sarah was, very on this case and very involved in it. And I thought, if much more of this research goes on, I'll have to disappear.
I would say this speaks to the work too, because I always describe myself more as a sprinter than a marathon runner. So I'm also surprised I saw it all the way through in a way. But that there were just still continuously, every time that I'm presenting this work and sharing it with other people, I think that was also, the impetus was being very fascinated and not being able to kind of put away some of these works and wanting to learn more, and still spending time with them even during this presentation. Like, there's still more I'm learning and gleaning and piecing together overall. And that there didn't exist a good visual record, even of the small period that's covered in the book. So this is also my hope, is the book is kind of very factual, and it presents a lot of reproductions of the works, that it's also, a kind of impetus for more thinking about this work, because I do see a lot of transpositions between the now and a lot of prescience in your work.
I think maybe there seemed to be a rich cultural art scene that was happening in Canada at that time. Would either of you want to speak about that a little bit? Do you agree or disagree? I mean, there seemed to be some good galleries and some good artists that were working. Were you working with anyone in particular then? Or?
Yeah. So that archive that I was working in was Les's first shows were David Mirvish Gallery, Hart House, and soon after working with Av. I think Av's gallery.
Worked with Jerry Morris.
Yeah, as well. Av's gallery was quite a small scene, but I have always been impressed by some of the work coming out of there. I think was an interesting cultural context. The previous research I had done a lot of research about John Cage's piece called Reunion, which was him and Marcel Duchamp playing an electronic chessboard. That happened in Toronto. So there was quite a thoroughfare of kind of thinkers. Media theory was very prominent in people's thinking, but I'm interested actually in, Les, your thoughts on artist reception of communication theory. It seems you were quite standalone in that regard.
Yeah, I think that artists were not happy with that approach, because in the time, you have to think about Toronto, let's say, in the early 60s as being like the United States in the early 40s. I mean, I don't mean that in any pejorative way, But I mean that the artists were still thinking about the artist as some kind of unfathomable, ununderstandable, mysterious, heroic character. And they hadn't quite come into the period of, I can remember being in Toronto when pop art first showed its head. I mean, it was utterly disgraceful as far as all the artists were concerned. Utter rubbish. I mean, a complete capitulation to vulgarism, etc. and so forth. This is how they approached it. And, the thing is that you may say, well, it was a big, rich situation. It wasn't. Not at all. More like Michael Snow, what your wife just said would be true. Okay, but there weren't. Unfortunately, there weren't. No, there weren't. Michael
Joyce Wieland was also in the Isaac's gallery.
Was really not your average Canadian artist by any means. Your average Canadian artist was somebody who believed in, the idea of, let's say, the group of seven, and becoming some kind of antecedent to that, and in many cases, even with Ab, when I would go into an art gallery in Canada, people would stand apart from me because they couldn't understand what I was doing. They thought they would think that I was destroying art, and many people actually said that to me, that what you do is destroying art. And some people would say, you do that and you call yourself an artist? And to which I would answer to them, I didn't call myself an artist, I just made art.
I mean, I read a lot of the popular press from that time too, because I was curious about the reception of this work, and it was a real split. And I would say at this period in Canadian life, at mid-century, it was also a big transitional shift from kind of British colonial influence and complete alignment, even in the schooling and the kind of that was where art stood. And then there was also, I think, conversely, a public eagerness to participate in this thing that was called, that was the modern, that seemed to be occurring, just across the border in New York. So there was a kind of generalized public sense of wanting to participate in this other moment. So that, I think, and these works were very titillating then for those people. So, for example, Slipcover literally gave a decor update to an existing, very staid gallery inside of the Art Gallery of Ontario, actually recovering a site that would have held European painting, to this day holds European painting.
Yeah. But the thing at the time is, think about, who were the major famous artists in Toronto at the time. Harold Town, the sculptor Jerry, what was his name? I can't remember.
I somehow managed to avoid having to take Canadian art history.
And most of these people were going around town behaving, very badly and making declarative statements about this, that, and the other thing. And, the whole idea seemed to be sort of like to emulate somebody like Jackson Pollock, not in his painting style, but in his actual mannerisms of behavior. They would be, they would go to the pilot, when you look at what they were doing, it wasn't of the period. It was of a previous period entirely. And it was very, very tame stuff. And never mind being tame, but it wasn't as good as the Group of Seven in many cases. I mean, if you think about a lot of the painting that was going on in Canada, and it was mainly painting, Jerry Gladstone is the name I was thinking. A lot of what was happening at the time didn't come close to people like Emily Carr or those kinds of people. It wasn't as clearly distinct in terms of a voice. It was just this kind of, landscape or figure or something that was more or less nondescript. And,
I mean, simultaneously, the Isaacs Gallery was also hosting what were called the mixed media concerts that I think I was working with Udo Kazmat's a composer. So it did mean that there was a kind of circuit, at least in the new music and electronic music scenes, that were traversing this kind of territory at the same time. So a lot of, both simultaneously, a lot of retrograde, sort of very conservative work being done, and then inroads, I think, and the close proximity of sites even between Toronto and Buffalo meant that experimental arts, visited Toronto as well. So there's a bit of a back and forth in that period too. That's interesting, at least to me.
Yeah, and in New York, we always thought, at least amongst the younger artists that I knew at the time, they always thought, Canada has the right attitude because they have the Canada Council, and they have the idea that artists should be supported financially. And I would say to them, but look at what they're supporting. and from my point of view, I always felt that might have been okay as an idea, but it's not such a great idea because in the long run, the Canada, it has sort of developed a kind of art, in my opinion, that sort of must fit a certain mold. And I suppose Sarah might disagree with that, but nevertheless, even though the most of the art that was being made in Canada at the time was fairly staid or what have you, there was still a lot of envy amongst better artists in New York about the fact that these artists were easily able to make a living.